I'm going to review quickly two announcements. Then I will go through as quickly as possible the first part of the history of the automobile. You have a reading from the Encyclopedia Britannica to cover the whole thing in detail, but today I want to focus more on the future of the automobile and possibly have a short discussion with you. If not today, we can postpone it until Tuesday of next week. Today, as usual, we're going to watch scenes from a movie, and we will see the central segment of the film where the most important things happen. Anything after that is the obligatory happy ending, and nothing surprising is going on. Okay, you have assignments already listed, due Wednesday of next week, and you've completed your first assignment, but I haven't reviewed any of those assignments yet. I'll work on that between tonight and tomorrow. As you can see from the screen, I make some changes, more extensive changes on the Future of Automobile page. I added links. I replaced some bullet point style phrases with slightly longer narrative to make this more readable and turn this into a reading. So in case you already printed it or read it before those changes were made between yesterday and this morning, keep that in mind. I made also a couple of corrections to the Transportation, Energy Sources and Civilization presentation. While I was presenting on Tuesday, the moment I was saying some things, I realized, is that true? I need to check on that. And in fact, yes, the presentation had been created after notes that were drafted, put down several years ago, but what I said about windmills and the chronology of windmills, and also in part the chronology of water mills, was wrong. I predated both by several centuries. Okay, so yes, some water mills can be found during the age of the Roman Empire. Windmills come during the European Middle Ages, even though that kind of technology was experimented with during the age of the Romans, but they never got to make anything close to a windmill. As usual, I'm advertising events that have relevance for this class. The most relevant event in this area, if by area you define a radius of about 100 miles, is taking place this weekend, both Saturday and Sunday at Lime Rock, Connecticut. There will be historic races subdivided into several categories from the first decades, from the pre-war era up until the 90s. And on Sunday instead they have a concours d'elegance with not only collectibles, vintage cars, but they also invite anyone who thinks they want to show their car to go in. And in fact, several cars and coffee groups, even from Long Island, attend. I went years ago with other people who own Fiat 500 Abarths or turbo modified. And so we went there, we spent a couple of hours, and then we went to get burgers. Not that anyone was very interested in our group of cars, right? The cars are placed all around the racetrack. That's why they can easily have more than 1,000 there. So, as you find in here, Enzo Ferrari was wondering how the invention of the wheel came about, since we don't know the name of the individual or individuals who came up with the idea. It must be one of those inventions that came about in different locales. And his idea, as an expert of motors, was that the inspiration would have come from nature, from looking at flowers or seeds rolling on a hill. But keep in mind that, to be more exact, in order to make a wheel work, you have to put it together with an axis. And the combination of axis and wheel, as you see in this carriage, in this military carriage from Mesopotamia around 2500 or 3000 BCE, that combination wheel plus axis is one of the 6 simple machines, the simplest way to multiply, amplify energy, right? Together with the lever, the inclined plane, the screw, the pulley, etc. And you can click on these links to explore. The links you find in here, unless it is indicated, are not required readings. I mentioned Leonardo's automotive self-propelled cart just to dispel the idea that Leonardo invented the automobile. So we already said Leonardo did not invent the bicycle, he did not invent the automobile. We can add to the list, he did not invent the helicopter, he did not invent the tank, he did not invent parachutes or scuba diving apparatuses, but that would be the matter for another class. In the past I've offered class where I talked about these things. Now we will talk just about the automobile that you find in his notebooks, or this kind of vehicle that you find in his notebook, which is of course brilliant. I'm not trying to say that Leonardo was not a brilliant inventor, just that some of his purported inventions were in fact part of the portfolios of European engineers since the late Middle Ages. And these higher paid engineers would travel around and show these inventions. And when they were hired by rich patrons, no one told them, okay, make this for me, make this flying machine for me. They would rather say, make a cannon for me, or build a fortress, or build a bridge for me, right? And everything else was just part of the hiring process, having this kind of fancy resume. In this case, we didn't know much about it until 20 years ago or so, but more recent scholarship has found evidence that this was not supposed to be any kind of moving vehicle. It was a theatrical prop. And in Florence, during the 1470s, theater was a big public event. And of course, they would try to make it as extraordinary as possible. In this particular case, someone evidently approached Leonardo and asked him to make a small vehicle, right? Something like 3 feet by 2 feet, that could travel just a few feet on a stage with a statue on it. It could have been probably the statue of the Madonna or the statue of a saint. It happened during a religious show, and religious shows were big even as a form of popular entertainment, not just as something confined to the churches. So there was no intention on the part of Leonardo to make this a vehicle. And he knew, most probably, about the intrinsic limitation of the propellant system, of the energy storage system. Because, as I said, it's very ingenious. You have a system of springs, you load the springs, and then you pull a string, as you can imagine someone, maybe Leonardo himself, doing backstage, and this car goes on, okay? But it cannot travel fast because of the limitation of the material. The lightest material you have is wood, and the limitation of the storage capacity in terms of energy of the springs from those times. I do invite you, so you see, and in a typical fashion, you don't find here the entire blueprint. So whatever model you may have seen, even in New York City, there was an exhibition maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, with some of Leonardo's invention, all those modern models required an engineer to be made, because what you find in Leonardo's notebooks are drawings, not blueprints. So there are parts that are missing, there are parts that are wrong. And there the theories are two. Either Leonardo was not that advanced as an engineer, which is possible, but I would discard that possibility. The other intriguing theory is that Leonardo intentionally put there something wrong in case anyone stole the manuscripts, or even looked at the manuscripts and tried to steal the idea from him. I invite you to look at the videos that you find in here. I added a few notes about this, but you can find modern models. You can even buy a kit and make it yourself on a small scale. And you can see that it is in fact a toy. And Leonardo, if you look at the biographies from the period, did make such toys multiple times. We have multiple anecdotes about flying toys, or towards the end of his life when Leonardo was in France, about a lion that he made to appear in front of the King of France. The lion would advance a few steps, then raise the front paws, and from the wooden chest would open, and lilies would come out, because the lily was the symbol of the monarchy of France. Again, nothing more than a few steps and cogwheels, springs, nothing that would point in the direction of a real prototype for future development. And this is it. This is the first vehicle that we can call a form of automotive vehicle, a self-propelled vehicle. It's a steam carriage with 3 wheels, with the boiler in front. It was made by an army engineer in France, and the function was to carry artillery, barrels of artillery in the back that would then be taken off, reassembled on a platform, and used. There are replicas that you find, a couple in France, one in a museum in Paris, and even in this case, I've added a video if you wanted to see it move. So there you have it. Of course, you have a lot of weight up front, but exactly because in here you put the barrels, the big barrels of these big artillery guns. Okay, just the barrels, not the combination of wheels and barrels that you may have seen. In here you have the driver and the person in charge of stoking the fire, and you have a handle so you can move it around. As I said, the speed is very low, but considering that during this period, for a couple of barrels of big artillery pieces, you would have needed perhaps a dozen horses. It was seen as an advantage. Of course, it is not very practical. The range is quite limited in that while you're driving, you cannot refuel, put more coal in the boiler, right? As soon as you run out of pressure, because there isn't enough water or because the heat is not sufficient to maintain the pressure, you have to stop, get down, add more coal, wait for pressure to form again, and then you can continue. And of course, you can see how this mechanism transmits the energy to the front wheel. This was made in a couple of exemplars, and one of them, according to tradition, had an accident, hit a wall. This is the video that I was talking about. Perhaps we can. That's how slow it is. This is real speed. And then of course you have a flame and artillery. Sorry, you were saying.
It looks like the machine from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like when they're going through the.
I don't remember that. I've seen the movie, both
Yeah,
the original movie and the
original
remake,
one,
but
when
I
they go
didn't
through-
remember.
The original one, when they go through, like, it looks like they're covered in like.
And of course, since they don't have the actual barrels, they put the barrels of the guns, they put ballast, right, to balance it. And during the 19th century, you find plenty of single examples of steam carriages, which are a crude juxtaposition of a regular carriage and a steam engine. That is to say, they're not very creative, they don't show any kind of promise, right? This is just one of many that were made in France, in England, in Italy. This is an example made by an army engineer in Italy. His name was Bordino, and you still find it in the Museo dell'Automobile in Turin, which is the largest in Italy and the one with the best collection in reference to the whole history of the automobile. So again, you have a steam engine in the back, and you have someone working the engine who would be able to put more coal, and the rest of it is practically like a carriage without the horses, right? And I added images and links to the museum. The museum even has a screen behind it and a kind of show for the visitors.
I have a question.
Yes?
Did these inventions inspire the trains, or were they inspired by the trains?
No, the steam engine is behind both. So some of these carriages predate the train. For example, there is one in London from 1802, which apparently exploded at one point during one of the rides. So the steam engine showed its potential, but soon enough it became clear that trucks and big locomotive engines were the best way to exploit this technology, and steam cars will come back later on, but only after the automobile had been invented. So the steam cars that were so popular, such as the Stanleys, that were so popular in the 1900s, in the first decade especially, are practically someone taking everything else in the automobile and adding a perfected, improved steam engine with the miniaturization of a lot of the technology. And at that point, they were very popular because, of course, there is the practical inconvenience of having to wait for the water to boil, right? So you cannot just jump on the car and go. Best case scenario, you have to wait 5 or 10 minutes. However, once you get going, you have this enormous amount of torque. You have a lot of power at your disposal, the same as with electric cars of today. Okay. So let's jump ahead. And as I said, you have an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica with a clear, systematic, comprehensive presentation of the history of the automobile. I want to initially go back and talk quickly about what is significant in each period, okay? Because in many ways, the article that I assigned as a reading is overwhelming in the number of details, and there is only a few things we need to know for now, and more we'll learn from other readings from this period. So the periods are more or less arbitrary, right? So it's not a given. More different periods could be thought of. The classification could be changed. And for this period, I took 1885 as a starting year, simply because that's the year of the patent registered by Karl Benz. And again, there are others during the same period that are working on the idea of the car, but certainly when you look at that patent, when you look at the blueprints from bands, you see that it is the real thing. Okay, so we'll leave any controversy about who really was the first inventor to other discussions, and we'll take 1885 as the beginning in the history of the automobile proper until 1909, because that's when the mass production of cars really takes place. Okay, so this is the period leading to that transformation. So it takes 20 to 25 years for cars to be ready for large-scale production and to be ready for regular use, right? Not just for once in a while use, not just for being taken for 10, 20, 50 miles before something breaks down. Still, when we talk about regular use in the 1910s or 20s, the mileage is not nowhere near for the average user what the kind of mileage we put in, for example, in a suburban area such as ours. So keep that in mind. You have many companies that are created during this period, and of course a lot of them survive only a couple of years or 5 or 10 years, and then they go out of business. And keep in mind that the way the industry works is quite a bit different, because there are some factories, some companies just working on the chassis, others do chassis and engine, many do just bodies, car bodies. And this will be a tradition that will continue well into the 1970s, and then it'll fizzle out. And when I'm talking about body makers, I'm not just talking about custom-made cars, which you find both at the beginning of the era, right? So a Maharaja from India, or a British lord, or an American millionaire would go to a car maker or a body maker and say, make my car unique. And of course they would pay a lot of money and the car would be made. Something like this is still possible. You can go even to a company such as Ferrari and pay a lot of money and have a unique body put on a Ferrari chassis. I'm talking about companies that would make hundreds or thousands, or later on tens of thousands of bodies per year, but just make the bodies, and the chassis would be provided by a company. So for example, Cadillac at some point in the 1980s would send chassis of the Alante to Italy with planes, and this was a car that was sold, I bet at least 10,000 a year they would sell. And in Turin, a body maker would make the body of that car, okay? And these are the most famous names in the body making industry: Bertone, Pininfarina, Superleggera. Bertone went out of business. Pininfarina is still active in collaboration with car makers such as Ferrari. Superleggera is active with some mid to lower level brands, but small numbers. We're still talking about small numbers, or in the case of Pininfarina, mostly the project, not the actual production of the line of bodies. And so it is possible during this period to just be an assembler, right? Someone who is not making a car, is just putting it together by buying chassis, by buying engines, by buying bodies, and then selling it to the public. Of course, innovation from one year to the next is big, and innovation drives sales. You have something new, something different, people will want to buy your car even if they have one that is 1, 2, 5 years old, okay? And the market distribution in terms of the technologies of the engine is quite interesting. During the early 1900s, there are areas of the world, such as the United States, and periods, seasons, when the market is almost equally subdivided between steam engine cars, electric engine cars, and internal combustion cars. So keep in mind that both steam cars and electric cars were big in the market early on and until the 1920s. The 1920s is when they will die, when those industries will die. Next decade is a bit weird, because of course by the end you have World War I and you have a lot of resources being applied to the technologies, right? They want to have armored cars, they want to have trucks, and you may be familiar with what happened in Paris in 1914 when the Germans attacked by surprise and went through the French lines. How did the French army move reserves from Paris to the front lines using taxicabs? Okay, and you still find some of them. They have one in Turin, for example, some of those original taxicabs. So they would put 10 or 12 soldiers on these taxicabs, and they would drive several hours to the front lines. And they moved thousands of soldiers that way. So from the get-go, you have a different vibe, even though World War I was trench warfare. In spite, as I said, of the use of tanks, the use of armored vehicles, the use of radios, planes, etc. All together in society, even though these inventions, not just the automobile, but the other inventions, become popular, very visible, most people in society still go by an older, pre-technological, pre-industrial mindset. Okay, so there is a lot of catching up culturally and socially, right? People are not used to coexisting and interacting with these things. They see them as marvels, as toys, as exotic items. They're not part of normal life. Okay, so we get to the 1920s. Steam and electric cars production of steam and electric cars come to an end because they're not commercially viable. And there will be no development for electric cars until Tesla, really. So for another 80 years. Yes, of course, Tesla is not the first one. Honda, other car makers tried to introduce electric cars in the 1980s and 90s, but nothing significant happens until the Tesla comes out, the Tesla Roadster. We have World War II during this period, so another big push for anything on wheels because you need to mobilize guns and soldiers, so much so that they come up with this idea. This is just one example. The Germans had the Kubelwagen, but the Jeeps, the general purpose vehicles, I'm not talking about the Jeep brand, but the Jeeps as a category, it was called Jeeps, come out, and you see some examples. The Willys is one of the most famous, but it's significant because it introduces a category, right, that is still very much successful, in demand, okay? During the first part of this period, 1920s, 30s, part of the 40s, you have the complete standardization. Because initially, if you look at any number of antique cars, you find that the number of pedals, the function of the pedals, the disposition, the layout of the pedals, what kind of levers you have around the wheel, on the wheel, next to the seat, change from car to car dramatically, okay? By the late 1920s, Cadillac already has a standard car by 1916, but by the late 20s, most cars are standard. So you can go from one to another without any issues, right? You know where the clutch is, you know where the brake is, you know where the gear, the shift is to shift gears, etc. Of course, during this period, you have a lot of women becoming regular car users, even though, as I said, you find plenty of women pioneers in the first period, women pioneering the technology of the car. And in fact, even the literature we will be reading often celebrates the woman driver, the female driver, as an empowered, independent woman. Car racing becomes very, very popular. Hundreds of thousands of people goes to see races. Speed records were a thing during that period. They're still going on, right? But they don't attract as much media coverage as they did during this period. And of course, you have the development of suburban and exurban areas such as Nassau County, Suffolk County during this period, because people with an automobile can then more easily commute. Next period is practically the golden era, although the proper golden era would be these 20 years. So the mechanical aspect of the car comes almost to a level of perfection, yet you have cars that people can still work on, right? And it was not uncommon in the United States, for example, during the 1960s and 70s, even 80s, to have people changing their brakes and working on the car and doing different things. Something that has become increasingly more difficult at this point. So the car is an industrial product, but the best exemplars from this period are still somewhat artisanal, right? And that's why they command those high numbers, millions, tens of millions for vintage cars from this period. And why these are not more antique cars, but because the antique cars are less drivable, right? Just think of having to crank your car if you have an antiques. And in fact, you go to these gatherings, and most people who, even collectors of authentic cars, have added ignition, electric ignition to their cars because they don't want to crank the car up. And also because it's not just a matter of, oh, I have to bend down and I have to move it, which was, by the way, one of the ways they marketed electric cars to women. Buy an electric car, because otherwise, if you buy a regular internal combustion engine car, you'll have to bend down and assume a posture that is really not ladylike. The crank is kind of dangerous. You have to know how to move it, because the moment the engine starts, you have to let go. Otherwise, you can break a finger, even now. And then, if you're looking at some of the cars in the earliest part of the 1900s, it's not just cranking the car. You have to make sure you have enough gasoline in the chambers, in the carburetor, or the pistons. You have to pump oil into the system, because the oil, there is no pump that goes by itself. You really have to pump it, not only before you start, but while you're driving, you have to pump oil into the system, which is why in race cars of the past, you would have two, the driver and the mechanician, called mechanician, not mechanic, because the mechanician would pump oil, pump water, make sure everything was working. So you can see videos of Mercedes-Benz race cars from the early 1900s at Pebble Beach in California, where in August they have the best cars on the planet gathering together. And it might, and even with experts, it might take 10 minutes, 15 minutes to start the car, because everything has to be just right, okay? Nothing of the sort here. By this time, you have Formula One races, but also endurance races. The 24-hour Le Mans, the 12-hour Sebring, the 24-hour of Daytona, etc., etc. You have these big races, the 1,000 kilometers of Nürburgring, etc., and they attract hundreds of thousands of spectators during a single weekend. So they're a big thing during this period, and they have multiple categories, all kinds of categories, with championships at the national level, at the world level. So, okay. As I mentioned, by the 1960s, the car is a pillar of the industrial economy, right? It's a big, huge product. A lot of dollars are being spent by each family on that. And of course, in terms of the economy, by this time, in some countries, including the United States, trains become less important, and more stuff is being moved on wheels. And this causes simple changes, which you see reflected in today's families as well. For example, canned goods are not sold as much as frozen food, because you have trucks delivering those frozen foods, and therefore that becomes the staple in the kitchen of a typical American family, more than canned goods, both still in existence. 1980s, 2000s, the big mergers, right? You don't find dozens of companies per country, per nation. They go from dozens to less than 10, less than 5, in some countries 1 or 2. Okay? And not only, but you see how innovation is stifled from the fact that throughout the post-war era, from the 1960s on, essentially, there are no significant new players until Tesla comes out, right? So no one can create a successful company of a substantial size. Small companies, if you want to make a few sports cars, custom-made cars for rich people, yeah, but nothing big until Tesla, right? And very limited innovation because there is no competition. In fact, what is new in those cars? There are marginal changes, right? And marginal savings. It's not like, oh, we have improved the assembly lines, we can make the car much cheaper. No, not really. Or just look at one example that I think is very telling. How long will it take for cars to integrate well with phones, right? Because they're closer to it, but not quite there, right? So why should it be so complicated? And smartphones came out, the iPhone came out when? 2005? So how long will it take for the industry to realize that every passenger and driver has a phone, and it should be much easier to connect the phone or to switch from my phone to the phone of a friend who's a passenger at some point and wants to play music. So some brands are better at this, others are not, but altogether the standards are not there. Style and design, accessories, everything is massified. So from the 1990s on, cars are boring. For the most part, are boring. At least big production cars, right? Of course, if you buy a unique, exotic car, those are never boring. But regular cars for regular people like you and me are boring, right? Nothing to really brag about. And moving from brand to brand, the category is more important, right? All cars of a certain kind will share the same features, more or less, etc. Of course, assembly lines are automated. You have robotic arms painting the cars, welding the cars, right? And therefore, the car is no more an artisanal product, is more of a serial product. Part of the of making the car boring and dull is a process that is similar to what's happening in Hollywood. Why is Hollywood not able to make any exciting movies anymore? Because they go to focus groups and they say, did you like the movie? And this only makes for neutral products, right? Because if you want to please the majority of the people in a focus group, then you have to find some kind of happy medium, right? And some movies would never have come out if they had listened to focus groups. Focus groups sometimes are ignored, right? But sometimes they work in killing a movie or in forcing a movie to be re-edited, reshot, etc. And the uniqueness of the car is replaced by branding. So my car is boring, but anyone can see it's a BMW or a Volkswagen or a Cadillac, right? So that's the extent of how unique your car will be. But then every Cadillac, every Volkswagen, every Audi is just the same, right? If you see one in the rear view mirror, can you recognize a Q3 from a Q5, from a Q7, from a Q8, from a Q2? No, they're just the same. The front of the car, if they're all from 2021, is just the same, okay? Big grille, etc., etc. And we come to the 2010, and you can see this increase. Of course, there is a dip with the house bubble crisis, right? People having less money to buy cars. Then it goes up, mostly because of growth in sales in India, China, other developing countries, goes near 100 million then cars per year, and then it goes down again. And of course, for those countries, and in part for ours, cars are being sold because the alternatives are lacking, right? You may have public transportation, but it's not working well. You want to avoid it, or you don't have it at all. And what are you going to do? Build an infrastructure for trains, subways, or tell people to buy a car. The roads are there, right? And companies who have merged and now are groups, it's a Ford group, the Audi group, the Volkswagen group, well, Audi is part of Volkswagen. Every group has maintained some of the brands just for marketing, because you know that Lexus are more luxurious than Toyotas, and Scion was their attempt to capture the younger market, right? And Daihatsu is for often smaller cars, more and cheaper, not sold here usually. Same with Honda Acura or Hyundai Genesis and Kia. Hyundai, the mid-segment, Genesis, the high segment, Kia, the low segment, right? But then, of course, each brand now, Kia has several levels, so things do change a lot. Same with Fiat, who owns all these brands and uses them for marketing, even though they share the technologies, right? So a Maserati may have a Ferrari engine, a Lancia may have a Fiat chassis, same for an Alfa Romeo, etc. And of course, part of this branding is these design cues. Why are those grills in front of the car getting so big? Because you have to see it and in a split second know what it is, what car it is, right? So that's the maximum of their effort to make the car elegant. And in general, you see the marketing ploy, because every time you go try a car, it's just good enough, but it must be also disappointing in a clear way, right? Because if you're satisfied with the model that cost you $25,000, you'll never think of upgrading to the $35,000, the $40,000. So it has to be good enough, because if it is a piece of junk, you will not buy it. But you have to recognize that it's not as good as the next one, which is something that that also you can see in a negative way with some video games, right? There are some video games, for example, the first few editions of Forza Motorsport, where if you try and drive a Ferrari Testarossa or a Maserati Birdcage, you say, well, what kind of piece of junk is that, right? They're almost impossible. And you think, well, someone was driving these cars 250 kilometers per hour. Someone was driving those cars for 24 hours. How is it possible? They just make it so that the users will want to grind and make credits to buy AMG, Mercedes, a Pagani Zonda, etc., right? Same with the cars, right? So maybe the company has saved, let's be generous, $200 with the suspensions in a $25,000 car, okay? But you can feel the road. It's not as comfortable. And if you want suspensions that are more comfortable and cost $200 more, you're supposed to buy the $35,000 car, okay? And unless you know about these things, and the first thing you do, you buy a car cheap enough and good enough, and you change the suspension. You have your expensive ride with very, very little money, okay? And packaging, of course, right? So I like this car, but I would like to have, I like this SUV, compass SUV from Jeep, but I would like to have the sensors, right? Because I want to be safe, okay? So with sensors, you have to go all the way up to the limited model. This was what happened a few years ago, right? So you would have to spend $5,000 more, because it would not just be the sensor, it would be better speakers, it would be different seats, etc. So it's like packaging for TV channels, with some differences between USA and Europe. The electric revolution is a failure, in my view. You can click and see the numbers, right? 2021, 640,000 electric cars sold, but how many electric cars you see around, really? If you go on Nichols Road or 347 and you stop and you count the cars before you see an electric car come by, they're not a significant presence. Yes, please.
Isn't the
And I'm trying, is David or no?
Keegan.
Ian, okay. Try.
Keegan,
I'm sorry, Keegan.
Yeah.
Okay, go
It
ahead.
was close, though. It was close.
No, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, it's alright. Like when you scroll up, you said that there was like some sort of like design philosophy that like made them like good, but like not good enough so that they could buy the new one.
Marketing. It's marketing. It's about marketing ploys, right?
Yeah, like doesn't that just feel like really like like not malicious, but like manipulative?
It is, of course, but most people are not aware of that, right?
I guess not.
And that's why the business of dealerships is the bottom of the barrel in terms of ethics, right? There are all sorts of tricks they play on you in order to sell as much car as possible, even when you don't need it. As I said, it's easier in Europe or Japan to buy a cheaper, smaller car with a lot of nice features. So you don't feel like you're a schmuck while other people are driving around in these big cars, which could also mean big debts in their pockets, right? Big holes in their pockets. But this is what they do, right? And nothing, even for the dealership, nothing has changed. Tesla managed in most states to open the shops, right? Including in malls. But even there, in that kind of business, very, very little has changed. Carvana has tried to change the used car market, and they managed to do so to an extent.
Yeah, just a little bit.
But the formula has not changed since the 1920s, including the tricks to have you buy a car, right? So the failed electric revolution, I called it, because you don't see a significant amount of electric cars yet on the roads. They're being sold in larger numbers, but you don't see a lot of them around. So it's like books. There are a lot of books that are not read. They just sit on the shelf. These cars are not used as much as the other cars in some families. It's telling that they, especially in the beginning, but even now, want to make the electric cars recognizable. It doesn't make any sense, right? Because if that's the winning technology, you're selling the Corolla in millions of exemplars, well, put next to it the electric Corolla, the electrified Corolla, right? It should sell even more because, they have to make it special. They have to make it like a starship. The wheels of my electric Fiat 500 look like the wheels on the Scooby-Doo van, for example. And they have to use special colors, special doors, right? Like the Tesla. We open the doors up. It's like science fiction in the movies. Go to the door and the door opens up in all kind of weird ways, right? Which is good for COVID because you don't have to touch the door. But otherwise, what's the need for special doors, right? Anyway, so it's all a game. And self-driving artificial intelligence is not there yet, right? Plenty of accidents involving distracted Tesla drivers or even regular drivers. Hacking remains a strong possibility. Eventually, the AI will not really translate into much safer roads. But the biggest change could come from this, that if all cars on the road are driven by sensors, meaning even when they're driven by humans, the system can take over, then you may have narrower lanes, which is especially important in places such as Manhattan. You can widen the sidewalk. You can plant more trees or grass on the wider sidewalks, right? Because you don't need to have as wide a lane in between houses as you do now. Of course, during this period, the most telling thing is the success of Uber. And by now, people are pretty much used to it, but it's a sign of things to come. So I have to decide whether to continue or switch to the movie, but I'll continue a little bit because I want to finish. So this is the last part. What is going to happen in our decade and the next decade? Well, some of these things are question marks, are hard to tell. For example, it seems that with COVID, we're going back to the city. So instead of seeing people escaping to the suburbs, a lot of people isolated in place. Some people moved out of the city, right? But not large number of people. Remote working is being threatened by a lot of companies, but it's there, and some companies have embraced it. And then you look at suburban areas and exurban areas, and you examine the reasons why people moved to Nassau and Suffolk in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And are the good reasons still there? A lot of traffic. Right now, more difficult to find parking in some areas, less green, and what's more worrisome is what I call privatization, right? Some of the most beautiful, I don't know if you're local, I don't know if you travel around, if you explore Long Island. I've been here since '94, and of course, as a foreigner, I have this desire to explore and drive around. Some of the most beautiful places in Long Island cannot be visited, really. You can drive through them, but only residents can park. Some of the most beautiful beaches on Long Island cannot be accessed unless you're a resident. Okay? So why should I be in the suburbs or the exurbs if I cannot avail myself of nature and other advantages? In that case, I might as well go back to New York City, which is what happened at Stony Brook, right? In the 1990s, still a lot of professors were living local. By now, very few are living local. Most are living in New York City. At best, they're in Nassau or from Huntington down to Port Washington, okay? Car ownership is going down in certain age groups, same with driver's license. So is the future of mobility electric? And that's where my recent reflection following my visit at Electrified Expo jumps into place, and this is in a series of pictures I took at Nassau Coliseum on Saturday at the Electrified Expo Electric Fair. The gist of my reflection is the following. Electric cars will be the future for some people, but not for most people. And most people will either use alternative platforms of mobility, or will have to use some kind of car sharing or rental system, and I'll provide more details. Car will not, of course, go extinct, but the future looks a lot like the past. I added in this presentation, because what was going on 120 years ago when cars could be as expensive as a small house? The richest people, the richest part of the population enjoyed cars. And the others had streetcars, still had carriages and horses, bicycles, etc. That's how the future looks like. Because if you went to the Toyota Pavilion, what is that you found there in evidence? The hybrid Toyota Crown. You can see right away that this is an expensive car. This is not made for this, that they're not really trying to make the electrified Corolla for the millions of tomorrow, right? This is Polestar, electric car by Volvo, another beautiful, expensive electric car. This is Kia. And again, yes, they did have one in a corner, a cheaper car, but the emphasis, and even the emphasis in terms of marketing, is on the EV6 and other models they have that are electric. Again, expensive models. At the auto show in April of this year, this is what they brought, right? They didn't have some small electric Kia. They had this SUV prototype. The emphasis in terms of marketing was there. You may find a cheaper electric car in their catalog, but this is not the direction of the company, right? You don't see it in their more grandiose plans. BMW, same thing. This thing is all electric, starts from $112,000, right? Meanwhile, what's going on? In some states, California was the latest, at the level of the federal government, in single European states, nations, and the European Union, more and more governments have declared from this date we will switch to electric. The date could be as early as 2025, as late as 2050. Yes, please, and your name, so I'm trying.
Did they have to do Dodge at the show?
I didn't see one, however, I skipped some pavilions. For example, I didn't go to the Chrysler, I realized later. So maybe it was there, but it was not a complete array of makers. Not all the brands were officially represented. For example, there had plenty of Teslas, but Tesla was not there officially with an official pavilion. Do you have a model in mind, or you're just a lover of the brand?
They came out with a new, it's a hybrid
Mm-hmm.
on the Hornet, and I think it's gonna come like out to the general market like next year. But it's supposed to be, they market it as an affordable electric car. I think it only.
So it's still hybrid,
like,
right? As you
yeah.
said, not
Yeah,
a.
but they were still marketing it heavily on the electric aspect of it for marketing purposes, but it started out, I think, about like 30,000.
But normally you would have expected that, right?
Yeah.
Hybrid can be cheap and can be usable. Of course, there is a price tag, but it's not twice as much, 50% more. A hybrid is competitive in all kinds of ways, including convenience and costs. However, when you see governments forcing the switch, then hybrid become a transition that will not really be long-lasting, right? Now, of course, why are government doing this? Because they blame cars for pollution, and without getting into the mess of the climate change debate, let me just help you reframe the examination of this issue. That is to say, instead of thinking about the formula, automobiles are responsible for pollution, say engines are responsible for pollution. And when you reframe the issue like that, then you can see that automobiles are a small part of the problem. Because technically, in terms of efficiency and release of polluting gases, the engines of cars are much more efficient than the small engines of the lawnmowers, of the leaf blowers, or the big engines, planes, and more importantly, ships. A single ship pollutes like a big number of cars. And there is no real attempt by government to curtail the pollution caused at those two ends of the spectrums, especially the ships, right? So part of this is the theater of loving the planet, right? We do this because we love the planet, we love you, we care about you. So since we care about you, you will not be driving. And some will be driving, but not all. Then there is the issue that batteries, chips, some of the components are not available in large quantities. They're controlled by few players on the global arena. And therefore, my prediction is that yes, price of electric vehicles will go down a little bit within 5 years, but then it will go up again when those things come into play, limited availability or control of the components by countries or companies who will raise the price, right? Because those components are vital. Then you, of course, to switch so quickly, you need a charging infrastructure, which is not there, right? I'm driving an electric vehicle. If you're not driving a Tesla, if you're driving a Tesla, then you have Tesla stations. If you're not driving a Tesla, even if you have, like me, 2-3 apps telling you where to recharge, there are very few, especially if you go from here to Montauk or Orient Point, very few places where you can recharge, right? So we're not there, and things have not improved in the last 5 years, much, even though money has been promised by the government. Then you have altogether a better electric network, right? As it is, we can barely have air conditioning on all houses in these areas here, the city, let alone recharge hundreds of thousands of cars. Time to recharge is longer, even for a quick recharge, and therefore the same station cannot serve as many cars as a gasoline station, right? Then you have the practicality. If you live in Alaska, North Dakota, places where temperature is low, even here during the winter, the range of an electric car can go down by as much as 50% once you get around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it goes down from there, right? And same with heat, extreme cold are not good for batteries, they're not good for electric cars. So, let me try and convince you with images. These are the people waiting to test electric cars at Nassau Coliseum. So, some are taking pictures, some are lining, some are minding their own business and looking at their phones, okay? And although there were plenty of cars, this is not where I saw the excitement. This is not where I saw people, the numbers of people going, right? Not there. Most people would go here to another area, another part of the parking lot where there was another simulated racetrack. And this was the area for electric scooters, electric motorcycles, electric bicycles. Everyone wanted to try it. Entire family were fighting to try it. People were like this, waiting. Oh, the next one is coming back now. I'll be next, right? This is where the excitement was, because of course, these are affordable. These are workable solutions. Because of course, I forgot to mention, when you're talking about charging infrastructure, think of people in Queens, people in Rego Park or Astoria trying to recharge their car out of a building with 100 apartments, 100 units. Where are you going to place those cars and recharge them, right? There are all sorts of issues, and you can see right away that this is something you could see yourself doing, something exciting, right? And this is, people were coming and going like crazy, all sorts of solutions, everything from three-wheelers to skateboards, everything was there, fat tires, small tires, right? People wanted to talk about these things, wanted to look at those things, wanted to see the bikes fold if there were folding bikes. And these things look very similar to what was popular in the 1960s and 70s. Small motorbikes were very popular, somewhat popular in the United States, very popular in Europe, and later on very popular in Asia. Even the style is quite similar. And we're talking about something that is easy to drive, comfortable enough, and will easily do 50 miles or more per hour in terms of speed. Anything more would be kind of daredevilish, right? But people were having fun. People were smiling, getting off of those things. And they had more areas with even more solutions, these weird skateboards, scooters of different kinds, bicycles, etc. So that is the future together with the car sharing apps. Microcars are another question mark, because microcars have been tried a number of times. From the 1920s and 30s on, they've never really taken off as much as they should have, right? This is an example they had in Nassau Coliseum.
I was just gonna say, aren't like e-scooters, isn't there a giant push against them by government officials? For example, I know in New York City they're banned, electric scooters.
Well, we should mention that up until a few years ago, electric bicycles were prohibited in New York City.
Yeah, I know why.
Which is absurd. So no, government should be behind these things, but in terms of commercial success, you don't really see big numbers for any of the models. This is yet another prototype, right? So you can get enough money from investors, right? You can promise this will be the future, then it doesn't come, right? And then you close shop a few years later. This was the auto show, the future of mobility, right? Small car, electric platforms to move luggage, etc. And as I said, this is not a new formula. At the auto show in 2011, they had the collection from the LeMay Museum of small and mini micro cars from all eras. So they've always been there, but never been a big success in the field of mobility. And now they're trying again, right? So this would be the last attempt, even by big companies. Citroën is a big French company, and this is the Ami. It's supposed to cost $5,000 or $6,000. They're selling it already, largely made of plastic, not a big speed, short range, but good enough for urban areas. And you can see the video. If you're interested, notice they have to give it the special cars, the special wheels, right? They have to make it special. They cannot have it look like a regular car. No, because they don't want it to compete with regular cars. This is the Renault Twizy, even smaller, but this time this is even expensive. This is above what should be the range for this category, between $3,000 and $9,000. This is above that. In fact, you can barely have it without doors, I believe, for more than 10,000. And if you want the doors, why would you want doors? But right? And this is a Swiss model that is about to go into production, but they've brought around prototypes for several years, Microlino. And this is exactly like a microcar from the post-war era, and you can find more in here. So at the almost conclusion of this discussion, this is what the future looks like according to me. So don't take my word, and in general, don't believe university professors when they talk about the future, your future or society's future. What I see is that, especially in urban areas, the masses, the majority of people will have to rely on electric scooters, motorcycles, bicycles, etc. Then, for quick transfers or longer trips or special occasions, they will rent something, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Revel. You see it already in plenty of places in the city. They started with Vespas, with scooters, and now they have a few Teslas around, the big Teslas for some reason. And you can rent them for 10 minutes, right? So you are about to miss the subway, miss the train, and you take one because it'll be quicker to go from your apartment to the subway station, even though it's just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, because you know you can drop it there and take the subway. The helmet is already there. Has anyone tried it? This? You have?
I wanted to try it, but I couldn't at the time use speed. Like, I wasn't old enough.
Okay.
But they're cool.
They're nice. They had the same scooter at the Electrify Expo. In general, you know that we're moving from ownership of things to a service formula, right? For example, right now, fewer and fewer people can afford a house and they just rent, right? And there are companies that are buying more apartments. So that's a sign. Now, it's not like this will be cheaper than owning a car. This solution will be almost as expensive altogether. It's just that cars will, if the switch takes place so early as 15 years from now, 10 years from now, that a lot of people will be priced out of owning an electrical car, especially if prices go down, as I predicted. The affluent part of the population will have big fancy electric cars that continue to have vintage cars, right? And you see the signs, right? Tesla, for years, talked about the cheaper Model 3 model car, right? And never really made it. They gave up on selling. Well, they still talk about it, but it's not there. So talk is cheap. Look at what is happening in urban areas. London, you have to pay a fee to access the downtown area. Manhattan discussed that just recently. San Francisco is discussing the same. For Manhattan, I think it was $23 or $25 to go south of Central Park every time you enter that area. They call it traffic reduction. Because freedom reduction doesn't sound as nice, right? Because basically, this is what it is, right? If I'm rich enough and I can afford $25 extra every time on top of what I pay to go through the Midtown Tunnel to go to Manhattan, I go. I don't think about it. But if I have an average salary, then I have to use the subway, etc. Other telling sign, vintage car market is thriving, right? So that is one of the exciting segments in the automotive industry. People are still spending a lot of money on traditional cars, right? So they'll continue to own those cars, but not everyone clearly can afford it. Look at how popular the resto mode industry has become. Resto mode would be a car that is made with modern parts, right? So Singer, for example, takes old Porsche 911s, as long as they're decent, they don't have to be running really, and from even just the body of the car, they remake something that looks like a Porsche but has a new engine, has new interior, etc. And they sell a good number of cars for this kind of industry, right? By 2018, they already sold 100 of them. And you can click and see the official websites, the videos in here. Lancia Delta was a famous model from the 1970s and 80s. And now there is this company called Automobili Amos making the Futurista, which is, again, a resto mode because they take the older cars from 40 years ago and they redo it entirely. The reason why they do it is that if you create a new car, it has to be homologated, and then you have to spend a lot of money. If you restore a new car, no one is going to force you to test the car to be homologated. Zelectric is a company in California, redoing older car with electric motors. And now they don't do replicas, they call them continuations. So Aston Martin is doing 2 continuation models. One is the Goldfinger DB5, which includes smoke, like in the movie, you can push smoke out of the car, and fake machine guns in the front. And then they have the Aston Martin DB5, which is like the one you see in No Time to Die. But it's not, considering the cost, it's not a small series. And then look at the other part that is exciting. Not the cheapest part of the market. There you don't see anything much new coming out. But the super exotic, cars from 2 million up, but not in small series, at least 100 units, sometimes 500 units. Again, you see a lot of cars coming out even recently. Bugattis, this was just announced in August and will come out in 2024. So the industry believes there is a future for that, doesn't believe that there is a future for a small electric car, really. The Ferrari Daytona will be producing 500 units. The series will be at least 500 units. The Lamborghini Countach, the Mercedes Project One, called it Project One, but they're planning a production of 100 of that. Okay? And so the full experience of driving will be reserved to amateurs. In this case, you don't really need to be super rich to drive a vintage or more recent car.